Stay naked. I hope that you can take it.
What can be learned from a story, woven out of fragmented moments of joy, pain, and blissful awareness? I wrote my first book, Flesh Mapping, in 2013. It was an invitation into co-creating a pedagogy, a way of learning through our shared narratives of place and politics, a way of mapping the injuries of the material, emotional, spiritual impact of all our many journeys of growth. Some may call it struggle, forced poverty, displacement, hunger, and war. As a child raised in war, I've learned many lessons. And in the art of living, I'm inviting some of my heroes, some of the people who walk with me, who have taught me to walk in beautiful ways, to see co-creation, to see community as our immunity to pain, to suffering, to wanting. Welcome. I'm your host, Sylvia Richardson, and this is The Art of Living. I am delighted to be joined by journalist and author Arnold August. Thank you so much for being with us, Arnold.
It's a pleasure for me to be with you once again. How are you out there in British Columbia?
Well, the news of, yet another attack on Cuba is alarming for many people, but very expected. Cuba has demonstrated resilience in terms of, surviving a 60-year blockade. So can you paint a picture for our audience who may not have been following the history of Cuba? What's going on? What's this conflict now about?
Well, the current conflict arises from the first years of the Cuban Revolution, 1959-1960. At that time, the United States did not accept the Cuban Revolution. They could not reconcile themselves with the fact that the Cuban people have taken political power and has taken the path of being a sovereign nation, building its own economic and social system. Thus, right from the beginning in 1961, the United States, this is now public, the State Department issued a call for a blockade, which openly said, this is not me saying it, they say everyone supports Castro, and there does not seem to be any opposition to Castro. Thus, what we have to do is to tighten the economic screws, make things unlivable for the Cuban people in terms of economy, salaries, or whatever, so that, and this is once again quoting from there, so that the Cuban people blame the Cuban government and revolt against the Cuban government. Now, that was 1960-61. What about 2021? It's the outcome of it, and it's the same situation. But what is particular and very frustrating, I think listeners have to really pay attention to it, and that is the current situation in Cuba. First, Cuba has suffered from the blockade over 60 years. But in the last few years, under Trump, this blockade has been tightened to the extent that over 240 specific new measures of sanctions were taken by the United States against Cuba, especially the Cuban economy. That's one thing. Now, Biden came to power, and those 242 sanctions are still in place. Now, we have to take into account a very important point. This new attack by Trump and now Biden against Cuba is taking place in a situation of a pandemic. It's really horrific to think that they are not even considered lifting the measures as a result of the pandemic. So this has created a very bad situation in Cuba. As a result of the pandemic, for example, the tourism industry has suffered enormously, and Cuba depends on the tourist industry. And then mixed with that is the ongoing sanctions that are carried on, what makes it virtually impossible for Cuba to use the little funds that they have, hard currency they have, to buy material, food, and etc. that is necessary for the Cuban people. So you have this, a poisonous mixture of 60 years old blockade, being hardened by Trump and now seconded by Biden, and all this in the context of the pandemic. And so, I think what happened on last July 11th, the most important feature of that July 11th, what they are called disturbances, was that some people, honestly, were expressing their frustration with regards to the effects of the blockade, the pandemic, etc. For example, people have to wait in line long hours in order to get the food and basic necessities. Of course, these long hours waiting in line is caused, among other reasons, by the fact that in order to maintain the COVID-19 under control, only several people at a time could enter these stores. However, there is a dissatisfaction. There's no doubt about it. Exactly what the State Department wanted 60 years ago. People should be dissatisfied. But the vast majority of the Cuban people are aware of the situation, but are not blaming the Cuban government, despite what the United States has been wishing over the last 60 years. Now, it's at the same time, into this mix of very poisonous economic and social situation, the United States and its allies, especially in Miami and others in Spain, organized a very specific Twitter war against Cuba, whereby they used very sophisticated methods, thousands of Twitter accounts fabricated out of thin air, each one able to retweet hundreds and hundreds of times per second this hashtag SOS Cuba. In other words, save ourselves Cuba. To the extent that within 24 hours, the hashtag SOS Cuba became a worldwide trend, and people were, hanging onto it, and the impression was given that there's a general revolt amongst the Cuban people against the government. You have this Twitter war going on. At the same time, the United States, the main corporate media in Canada, United States, and elsewhere, how do they portray the small number of people who were demonstrating against the Cuban government? They were very, very small. One cannot, sure, there were people who were involved in it, and there has been, several hundreds of them in Havana and other cities across the country. But allow me to give the listeners an example how the United States, American corporate media completely mislead the people. For example, on that famous July 11th, there was a massive demonstration in Havana in support of the Cuban government. Now, in that demonstration, photos that we see, you clearly see a Cuban flag, but you also see the familiar black and red flag of the July 26 movement, Fidel's creation back in the 1950s, indicating clearly that it is a pro-government demonstration. However, did this in any way hinder the corporate media? No, they published that photograph, and on the bottom they wrote, "This is a anti-government protest." Allow me to give you one other example. This came out just a couple of days ago with Ted Cruz, I think in collaboration with the CNN. Ted Cruz was going on as usual. We have to intervene in Cuba to save the folks in Cuba and all that. Now, the footage that they showed while interviewing Ted Cruz, the footage from Cuba, it originally had people holding signs, "Long live the Cuban Revolution," "Long live socialism," etc. What did they do? This is really hard to believe, Sylvia. I know you'll believe me, but some people may say, well, did that really happen? What they did, believe it or not, in that CNN report, as a backdrop for Ted Cruz, they actually blurred out the signs that were saying, we support the Cuban Revolution. So people were not able to see that this is a pro-government demonstration, and rather they just presented it as an anti-government demonstration. There are so many other examples. I think this media war that has been carried on by the United States and the corporate media and other Western nations. I think I've been following this for many years, but July 11th and 12th, etc. This has been perhaps the most vicious media attack against the Cuban people in many, many years. I mean, Twitter, it's supposed to be a social media, but Twitter is actually an instrument in the hands of the U.S. ruling circle to try and destabilize Cuba and provoke a revolt against the Cuban government.
Perhaps we could talk a little bit about why Cuba poses such a threat to an empire that has the largest military in the whole world, that has such power, and yet feels so threatened by a tiny little island. The Cuban people have chosen not to accept the saving grace that the United States, that would lead us to live maybe in the conditions that Haiti finds itself, or any of the islands in the region that are so-called democratic and, U.S. colonies.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Sylvia. Right from the beginning, United States could not and would not accept a country, even a small, poor island country with very little resources, to stand up to the United States and say, look, we are Cubans, we have a right to have sovereignty and independence. They never accepted it. And I think we have to add another feature that listeners may want to consider in the current situation. Even though Cuba is a small island, in terms of international politics, it punches way over its belt. It's very influential at a time, especially since the pandemic, where there are forces all over the world, for example, uniting together to oppose U.S. hegemony, U.S. domination, U.S. unipolar control of the world. For example, China is a very good example, and then you also have Iran, you have Russia, even though Russia, of course, is not socialist, but at least it's the government there stands up to the United States, Vietnam, Venezuela, Nicaragua. So there's a international move now, especially since the pandemic, to develop what we call the multipolar world, which challenges U.S. hegemony, U.S. attempt to dominate the entire world. Now, Cuba, of course, plays a very strategic role, not only from the fact that it's only 90 miles away from the U.S., but Cuba has increasingly close ties with China, Russia, Venezuela, Iran, and many other countries. And these countries, what they have in common, it might not be the social system as such. What they have in common is, I would dare to say, a hatred of U.S. attempts to dominate the world. Always, of course, Sylvia, in the name of humanity, helping people out. The same United States, ushered in the post-World War II situation by bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then you had the war in Vietnam. Then you had all the wars going on in Central America and Latin America against the people there. So this is the country that's supposed to be the salvation for people in the South. I would say that a result of their arrogant attitude with regards to Cuba, this has, I would say, increased the resolve of the progressive peoples in the world, whether it's in Canada, United States, and Europe, etc., to defend Cuba as a very important feature of the growing multipolar movement across the world. Now, talking about sanctions, there was an initiative, I think it was started by Venezuela, whereby a country, they established this new group, countries in the United Nations, in favor of the UN Charter. In other words, they're getting together to support, they need to support the United Nations Charter, and as a consequence, as part of this, is to oppose all unilateral sanctions carried out by the U.S. against all countries, whether it's Iran, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, etc., you name it. This is a very important movement, and I think Cuba is small, 11 million people, but Cuba's influence, Cuba's standing in the world plays a very important role in this new move by the countries around the world to oppose U.S. hegemony.
Now, I also think it's important to realize the power of one small nation who, instead of focusing their resources in developing weapons and and launching war against other countries, focus their efforts on health, education. And when you talk about how influential they are worldwide despite their small size, I think it comes to bear that Cuba has been a purveyor of health worldwide. We've known of Cubans going to areas where pandemics and health issues have been rampant, sending doctors. Their doctor brigades are really what Cuba is known for. So let's talk a little bit about what it has meant, even in the midst of all this aggression, even in the midst of all this blockades. Cuba has created within itself a population that's well educated, that's contributing to society in a wonderful way.
The United States declared that there's the troika of evil, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, but this troika of evil have the best statistics with regards to containing COVID-19, which shows, for anyone who is interested in reflecting upon it, the superiority of socialist system over the capitalist system, such as the United States, with all its riches, with all its advanced technology, etc. Their fight against COVID-19 is far inferior to what has been established, what has been going on in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. We're talking just about Latin America, but of course China is also important, a model for people looking to a new world. I think that one of the things that positive outcome, if we may say so, of the COVID-19 was that it tore away the screen about the capitalist system. The capitalist system is capable of functioning and all that, exposing to everyone. If the capitalist system is so great, how come they do not have a national health system where people can have treatment for any illness or whatever free of charge? How come? Whereas in countries such as Cuba, they have that. They've been building that since 1959, 1960. So I guess the United States is a bit afraid that people may look at the current situation in the United States, which has in general been a failure as far as COVID-19 is containing COVID-19 is concerned. People say, hey, wait a second. Maybe we have to look for a new system. Look what's happening in Cuba. Look what's happening in Venezuela. Look what's happening in China. So I think this is it's a positive thing if we may use that term that came out of COVID-19. People are necessarily thinking of opposing system, other social system other than capitalism. And there you have Cuba, as you mentioned, Cuba actually, while they're fighting COVID-19 successfully at home, they send hundreds of health brigades, the Henry Reed Brigade, with hundreds of doctors, thousands of doctors, to countries all over the world to help other countries contain COVID-19, even sending it to, for example, Italy, a wealthy European country, asked for aid from Cuba, and they send doctors right to the epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak last year. And there's so many examples. The only thing that is keeping people from revolting against the United States, in the United States and allied countries from Canada, is that these facts that we're talking about now are not really well known at all by the people. It is kept from public opinion. It is hidden from public opinion. And the only ones who really are trying to break through this monopoly public opinion, whether it's in Canada, United States, are people such as yourself, your program, and other similar alternative media in Canada, United States, and England. We really need the work that you were doing. And in this context, I would like to highlight the work of Kelly Soar, who in English and Spanish have done excellent work in general over the last year or two, but they specifically did a very good job in exposing how the United States manipulated dissatisfaction in Cuba as a result of the blockade and COVID-19, manipulated in order to try to provoke a revolt against the government.
I would say that we don't have to look too far to find evidence of how the media has distorted images in the past to exercise the acts of war. We saw it in Iraq. We saw it. We see it, in its constant aggression against Palestine. We see it in this constant aggression against Cuba. Right? Everybody's talking about Cuba as a threat, but we never think about Colombia, one of the most dangerous places in Latin America for union activists, one of the places that has been on fire right now since April. The people have been on the street, demonstrated en masse against their government, despite this being a very colonized country by the US, military bases. They have 7 large military bases, armed to the teeth, and yet the people there are uprising against the Colombian government. So in many ways, I think our job is to ask more questions as why now? How is this happening? And when we compare the numbers, you're right, of people who die from COVID in Cuba compared to the way the pandemic has ravaged the U.S. and other developed countries, it's shameful, that countries with so much resources have had such losses.
Colombia is a good example. Like, United States, Cuba. What about Colombia? We can say the same thing about Justin Trudeau, who has taken up the narrative of Biden against Cuba. This is not very well known because it's hidden from the public view. He's actually supporting the Biden narrative against the Cuban government at this time. Colombia is an excellent example. Hundreds of people have been massacred, but never a word by the United States, Canada, Michelle Bachelet from the UN so-called Human Rights Commission about with regards to what is happening in Colombia. So it's very, very, cynical, and it's frustrating. There's no doubt about it. I would like to mention, I guess we don't have too much time, but we're talking about what's happening in Cuba. Yes, there was only a small percentage of the people actually participated in what we call, these violent, lumpen proletariat type activities in some cities. I saw the footage of in Cardenas, a city in the province of Matanzas, and I could not believe my eyes. You actually had these vandals, actually attacking public property, actually attacking hospitals, etc. And I couldn't believe, is this Cuba? And it was interesting, Miguel Diaz-Canel, in his speech yesterday, public speak yesterday in Havana, he said that, a mother said that her his kid asked her, hey, looking at the images from these vandals, vandalism taking place in Cardenas and other cities, it says, asking, is this Cuba? I asked myself the same question. I mean, I've been, spent a lot of time at Cuba, and I've never seen this before. That people actually carrying out acts of vandalism against public property, and this is passed off by the United States as a legitimate revolt against the Cuban government. Which government would accept that people take it in their hands to throw rocks and burn public buildings, etc.? No country in the world would accept it. Why should the Cuban people accept it? And Cuba has every right to seek out, try, and prosecute those people who committed these acts of vandalism against common property in Cuba. And of course, when this happens, the United States and their allies, there would be screaming, look at that, Cuba is repressing. Repressing what? No country accepts vandalism. Why should Cuba accept vandalism?
In coming to a close as we
Yes.
realize that, this is a very old story. Empire means hegemony, means, dictating how people see themselves, right? And for us in Latin America, the United States has had its foot on our throat for over a century now, and we've
Right.
seen
Yes.
countless invasions in Latin America, over 100 invasions in Latin America. So it's not surprising that the Cubans are facing such aggression, right? They are one example against capitalism and a society that despite all these chokeholds, have been able to be resilient, to educate its people, to keep them healthy. And of course, the pandemic has really handicapped their efforts, and yet they are still doing much better than most so-called capitalist democratic governments around the world. So what is your call to people who are listening, who can see through the fog of fear and the fog of lies? What is your invitation?
But we really have to keep up this work about disinformation. Like yesterday, I was really enthralled. Miguel Diaz-Canel, as president, led an important demonstration of 100,000 people in Havana last Sunday. It was a magnificent event, but they barely showed any of that, or if they did, as I saw on one Montreal, I think it was CBC, they had to show it because you can't ignore it. 100,000 people in Havana with Miguel Diaz-Canel presiding over it as president, but they finished that up. They cut into a demonstration in Ottawa by 10, 20, 30 so-called Cuban Canadians who were asking Trudeau for an intervention in against Cuba. Now, so the point is that sure that took place in Havana, but really, it's just the government there, and they provide a platform by a few dozen Canadian Americans calling for U.S. intervention, Canadian intervention in Cuba. So, this is a really disgusting situation as far as the media is concerned in Canada. There are some exceptions, by the way, but in general, that is the case, and we have to keep on informing people with the means that we have about what the real situation is in Cuba, and especially the role of the United States. The most important lesson is, especially in the pandemic, Biden should lift the blockade against Cuba. And Justin Trudeau, instead of seconding Biden's support for the counter-revolution in Cuba, he should say to Biden, lift that blockade now. In fact, there's a resolution in the parliament by Nikki Ashton, NDP, calling on the Canadian government to call out Biden to lift the blockade against Cuba. But Justin Trudeau, the great Democrat, smiling guy, instead of responding to that, he actually seconded and supporting Biden's narrative to subvert the Cuban Revolution. I think people have to wake up to Justin Trudeau. The smiling Justin Trudeau, liberal, poster boy. These are the most dangerous people, the liberal poster boys.
Thank you for being with us today. I think that's a very powerful image. And, most of us have come to that conclusion already based on the treatment of Indigenous people here in Canada. The fact that we have unmarked graves and, on one hand, the government issue an apology, and on the other hand, they took Indigenous people to the Supreme Court to revoke, the decision to grant him, redress for the crimes that were committed against them. So we know that the Trudeau government has not been, opened and has not been dealing in good faith with a lot of people. So it shouldn't be a surprise that this is the case with Cuba and Venezuela and many other places in the world. So thank you for being with us.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you for listening to The Art of Living. I'm an educational consultant and artist, authored. For more information about upcoming events, workshops, retreats, please reach out to sylviarichardson.com. Until next time, remember to be playful, to celebrate joy, and to allow love in all your co-creations.
You'll never have to wonder where the groove went. The groove is you.